Okay, great. Looks like we are all live. Just double checking again that everyone online can hear us.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to be good about that this time, I promise. Welcome everybody to our February meeting of the Environment and Climate Committee. We're going to get started with a roll call. Alex.
Here.
Andrew. Here. Kevy. Here. Kelly.
Here.
Laura.
Here.
Mark Buckley, I don't see here.
Well, Mark said he was gonna join. He has to join late, just virtually.
Okay. Neil, I'm here. Rory, here. Serena,
Here.
and Smita.
Here.
And then are either of our ex officios, Jackie or Sasha, here? Oh, and Lauren.
Here.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay.
I like the speed there.
Yeah. Moving through. Minutes. Have folks had a chance to look at the minutes or have any comments or notes?
I read them.
Great.
I skimmed them.
Great.
Somewhere between skimmed and read them.
Okay. This is not meant to alienate. This is just your opportunity to speak now if there are any changes.
I'll move to approve. And then that's it.
Great. I don't think we need to, we're just approving minutes anymore. Trying to save time. But thank you. Hearing no objections, we'll just pass those minutes, or those minutes have been reviewed and approved. We'll move to public comment. Cassie, do you want, how do you want to run public comment? Do you want to run that?
Oh, sure. Are there any attendees in the room?
No one giving public
One
comment.
person.
Okay. No one making public comment in the room?
No.
Okay, and then we do have some virtual attendees. So if you are a virtual attendee and you are interested in sharing a public comment, you can use the raised hand function, which you should have on your screen. So you can do that now. And if so, we will call on you and provide you the ability to unmute your microphone. Okay, I don't see any public comments in the virtual attendees, so I think we can carry on.
Great. Moving on to the staff update.
Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry again that I'm virtual today, but hopefully I think it should work well for our agenda. The only update that I have for you all is that on February 21st, our next council meeting, the council will be having a work session on a study that our engineering team did on looking for the possibilities, exploring possibilities for in-conduit hydro power throughout our water system. So that's a topic that's been discussed for many, many years now. So one of the projects looked in that study was doing a big in-conduit hydro up at our water filtration facility. But it also looked at other areas of our water system where we might be able to generate renewable energy through hydro. So they were also looking up on the Aubrey Reservoir and a couple of other locations. So the next steps for that right now, we were just kind of doing a better understanding of feasibility, and then any recommendations from that would be carried out as we're doing master planning efforts and capital projects on those facilities. But the staff that led that are just going to share the results of the study with the city council and then just get feedback as well as general direction if these projects are something that we're interested in pursuing. So I just wanted to give you guys a heads up about that. It's part of the city climate action plan, our strategic energy management plan. It's a part of that. And it's also just been a big renewable energy project that there's been a lot of community interest in for a number of years. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys are all aware of that. And if it was something you wanted to learn more about, that you could tune in on February 21st. Any questions about that or anything else before we start our meeting today? And Neil, I guess you'll just have to let me know if there's hands raised or anything.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any hands.
Cool.
All right. Moving on, waste and materials working group. Yeah, the going over priorities. I don't know.
Yeah.
Kelly, are
I
you?
have a,
Great.
can I share I have a presentation I can use.
Yeah, you should be able to. Do you have the button that allows you to share your screen? Perfect.
Yeah. Perfect. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, great. So let's start with a high level summary. Over the last 6 months, the Waste and Materials Group has come together on a monthly basis to talk about remaining CCAP opportunities, as well as prioritizing those efforts and other items that we think would be added to the roadmap going forward. So this last Monday, we held a public meeting to discuss our personal prioritizations as well as the overview of the strategies. And I want to invite the rest of the subgroup to jump in, please, at any time. So we each ranked, and you'll see those momentarily, all of the remaining strategies, and then discussed through them as a group what we will look to prioritize over this year and what we have on the roadmap for potential development should resources and bandwidth allow to expand. So just taking a step, I have to move some things around so I can actually see it. These are the strategies. There are 8 of them. It's you'll see on the right-hand side the score. These are the scores aggregated from each of the members. And the lowest score is the highest ranking priority. So in number 1, is there a question? No, okay. In number 1, you'll see that we actually combined a few of the strategies. We felt that these were complementary efforts and that there was opportunity and benefit to looking at them as one single effort. It's largely around educational work for both residents as well as tourists in reducing food waste and reduction overall of consumption. So it's a lot of educational programs. The second is also supportive of that, more focused on the tourist piece. So we've got the residents and the tourists. And then the third and fourth remain on our roadmap. So the way that we're approaching these, we're saying we don't know, we've got to do a little bit more investigation. We've got to do more scoping, specifically for number 3. What industries would we be targeting? And then number 4 is a lot more research around what the state and specifically Portland has completed similar to this effort. So these are the overall CCAP strategies that remain, our ranking of them. Now we'll go into the top 3 if there are no specific questions. So strategy number 1, this is that combined effort of educating, informing, supporting our residents and reducing their food waste and food prevention. We've outlined outcomes, deliverables, and next steps. So it's terms of outcomes and deliverables. What we discuss is creating a more informative, how are we going to approach this strategy? What is I guess like success look like? And so one of those is, how do we better inform them through the City of Bend website? And so creating a informed sustainability hub where we can highlight different actions and activities that residents can directly take to reduce their footprint. The second is a complimentary mailing. So this may help to not only call attention to the existence of a sustainability hub, but help to reinforce much of the same messaging. And then the third is an activity, a reusable pilot project that we would be looking to implement at some interested food service companies, like maybe food trucks or restaurants. And Kavi is leading that effort and has a lot more details. So Kavi, I don't know if you want to step in now and talk a little bit more about that, or if you want to wait to the end.
Sure, I can just talk briefly about it and then maybe we can talk more at the end if there's questions or interest in discussing it further. So I think we're still pretty early stage in that, but I think one of the opportunities I've seen, and I think many other members of the working group have seen as we've been working on this is doing something that really is has a direct action in showing how we can reduce waste. And I think reusables, especially in the food service industry, is one of them with foodware and drinkware. Especially right now, there's basically any foodware or drinkware that's used that's not reusable. So a lot of the compostables that are used still end up they have to go in the trash in the state of Oregon. There's no compostables that are accepted in compost. And I think there's a lot of misinformation or just there's not clear information on that. And so one of the things that's kind of recommended right now and that we're seeing shift throughout the state is the switch to reusables. And I think there's, I attended a conference specifically that had a lot of information on what many cities are doing on how to create those systems to make that switch to reusables. And, there are different options to making that switch, where you can work with a private company that handles a lot of the kind of logistical pieces of it, like dishwashing that's required, or the city itself kind of creates those systems and works with a lot of businesses to create those systems. So I think we're still in the exploratory stage of which system or model would work best for us at the city level. And I think, at least from my perspective, this would be a good year to kind of move that forward to at least the point where we know like which system or model works best, and then maybe take some of those steps to maybe do a pilot project on a smaller scale. So that's at least my vision for it. I don't want to speak on behalf of the whole working group, but I think what we've talked about is having another follow-up meeting where we specifically delve into that more. If anyone else has anything they want to add. Okay. And we can talk more about it at the end. So that's one of the more like specific projects we can try to aim for this year. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. And much of what Kavi just said is true for what we're trying to solve more broadly, which is misinformation or misunderstanding of how to properly manage waste, as well as how to reduce it. And so the sustainability hub, the mailing, and then what activities can we take collectively, like the reusable pilot project, to address this more systematically. So in terms of next steps, we're meeting in early March. We're going to be developing content ideas more. So we're basically taking these outcome and deliverables and building that roadmap. What does a sustainability hub look like from a content perspective? What resources do we need? What timeline is realistic? So we're going to be working through a lot more of those like tactical details. A lot of what's the top two strategies, a lot of what's involved, and I think we talked about this in our last meeting, is engaging with City of Bend's new communications director. So really kind of understanding collectively, both with other groups as well as within waste and materials, what do we need to communicate? What is the best sort of medium to communicate that information? And then what is available to us in terms of like resourcing and city engagement. And then, as Kavi mentioned, the last step on this is that additional meeting to discuss the reusable pilot project. So the strategy 2 is very similar to strategy number 1. It's just focused on the tourists. So we're going to be thinking about this a little bit differently. Well, obviously the sustainability hub, if a tourist were to visit the City of Bend, they would have access to it, but it might not be like they wouldn't be receiving the mailings. It wouldn't necessarily be like as visible to them. And so how do we take that same information and make it available to people visiting our city? And so the toolkit is created to support businesses like restaurants, grocery stores, potentially hotels. What businesses and facilities should we prioritize this engagement to support educating and support and more broadly supporting waste reduction within the tourism industry? And the next steps are the same as strategy 1. So again, it's more of an outcome of that. Strategy number 3. So I mentioned really, we've talked about this very broadly, like specific industries. Do we want to target what are the products that are coming into our city? And so is it manufacturing? Is it real estate? Is it in construction? Is it food? So we need to scope this effort. What are the industries we want to prioritize? And that may be just based on the waste generated from them. What are the types of engagements that we may be able to lead with them? And then how do we get buy-in and support broadly, both from companies specific in that industry as well as companies here who are procuring and selling that material out into the market. So I think this is a fascinating one. The challenge will be how do we best scope it so that we have a realistic roadmap and timeline to achieve. And then the fourth is low carbon concrete. And Cassie, I may ask you you gave us a really good perspective of how complicated this is. So kind of at first thought that, we have a lot of construction occurring throughout the city. How can we implement low carbon concrete options? The city of Portland did a study on sidewalks, and that study has been completed. There were a couple other studies completed as well. And so, kind of at first glance, it was, well, let's take this information, these studies that were completed, and look to implement here in Bend, but it's a little bit more complicated. So Cassie, if you're okay, just giving a little bit of color, adding a little bit of color to this strategy.
Sure. So this trying to start using low carbon concrete mixes for city projects is something that we started working on a couple of years ago. And I think there is willingness to move ahead, but where they've kind of been able to make a lot of progress in Portland, there's still a lot of like systems set up that needs to happen in Bend to even make the information, to even have access to the information about the concrete mixes. And so there's work on, the concrete suppliers need to be providing certain information. When I was working on it 2 years ago, they were still not yet, they didn't even have that information to provide. So we were kind of asking them to start providing that information. And then simultaneously, once they're providing the information, we have to do a little bit of a different way of collecting information internally so that it's information that we can easily find, because the information about the carbon content, as well as just information about the quantities of concrete that we're purchasing, it's buried right now. It's not information that's easily available. So we did start doing some of that work a couple of years ago, but since it wasn't a top priority then, it kind of fell off a little bit. But just kind of sharing that, because I think there's definitely interest in us, like going ahead and kind of saying we're going to use low carbon concrete, but there's just a lot of kind of systems and data and like internal infrastructure that needs to come into place for us to even be able to move forward with some of those initiatives. So I committed to kind of re-engaging in some of those conversations here at the city, and then with the help of the DEQ staff, who've been really, really helpful in helping us to figure that out.
Yeah, and Cassie, you mentioned that we can have a council goal maybe dedicated to low carbon concrete to kind of help internally navigate all those questions, kind of organize ourselves internally.
Yeah, I thought I need to do a little bit more internal digging again, just since it's been a couple of years. But when I tried it last time, based on the amount of kind of organizational change that is required to actually be collecting this information and doing something with it, I thought it was possible that it might need to be some raised to the level of a council goal in order to get real traction on it. So I need to kind of talk again to our staff and relook at it again, since it's been a little bit. But that was kind of where I got last time, just based on the amount of things that need to change in order to be able to move forward with this.
Was this just the kind of structural back-end system of asking for and keeping track of, is it EPDs, environmental product declarations? Is that where the barrier is?
Yeah, it's collecting the EPDs, but at the time, like our two primary concrete producers weren't even providing the EPDs. So for the first step is for us to ask them to make the EPDs, and they might be able to do that now because I know that the DEQ was the one who was really working on that. But then once we get the information, and even how do we get it? Because typically we when we're purchasing concrete, like it's contractors purchasing concrete on behalf of the city. So it's not necessarily city staff purchasing the concrete. So trying to figure out like where in our process, updating our process so that we're asking the contractor to ask for this information, and then we're getting that information back from the contractor and storing it somewhere for us to analyze. And it was the EPD information, but then also because of that connection through like it's contractors that are procuring this stuff, even like the quantity of concrete, like the first thing I was trying to look at is like how much concrete have we bought in the last year and like in what applications, and that information is all kind of buried in these big project files. So even that information isn't like in a way where it's easy to access because we haven't needed to know on like an aggregate level before. So those were just the two pieces of it that when I just like barely lifted the hood that I got to, and I'm assuming there are more other things.
I'll just say, I think one of the biggest benefits of a program like this is exactly the first barrier that you mentioned of local suppliers not having systems, not providing EPDs or like the product availability. And that's where I think one of the main goals of this is to have a consistent buyer that makes it so then the suppliers have the capability to do that. Because if that's hard for the city to do, or if they're not responsive for this, and I'm not saying that they weren't being responsive, but the city and the state are big enough purchasers that they can make that available for them, where an individual project owner and trying to encourage projects to work on these won't have that same capability. So I think that's, I'll just reiterate that I think there's a lot of value in continuing to work down that path. Yeah.
And then the other thing too that I shared with the working group that, again, it's been a little while since I worked on this, but it's not like environmental product declarations are that it's like an information label that shows you the carbon content among other things. And it's not like there's a group out there that's like, this is a low carbon box, and these are your low carbon options. It's just that it gives you a rating. So kind of what I was advised is that our first step would be first getting a baseline of like, what is the average carbon content of our concrete level. And we could look at that in different applications if we felt like if it was easier to address in sidewalks than roads or in roads versus other applications of concrete. And so the first step we would need to do is get a baseline of like, what kind of concrete have we been buying? And what is the carbon content of that? And then, we would use that information to kind of like set a target that was improved upon that. So like maybe we want to get 25% better. And we feel as though, working with our engineering team, of course, to make sure that those other lower carbon options are going to be appropriate for the application as well. But so it's not as simple as just like, oh, there's concrete mixes out there and we can just pick the low carbon one. It's all kind of relative to each other. So you have to figure out like your baseline and then you try to improve upon that, if that makes sense.
Is this specifically just about concrete or also asphalt? You mentioned roads. Are those different, or are we kind of lumping them together?
The EPDs, this is for concrete specifically because concrete has just been identified as one of the higher carbon intensive materials out there, and the push to make those environmental product declarations, the DEQ focused on concrete first. They are, and the actual road is asphalt, but a lot of concrete still used in the construction of a road. for curb and that sort of thing, but the DEQ is currently working on trying to get EPDs for other building materials as well. So I'm not sure what those other building materials are that are high priorities for them, but concrete is where the focus is for this strategy and kind of where the focus has been in the state.
I actually had a question too, Cassie, and I think we talked about this briefly in our meeting on Monday, but and I also definitely don't understand concrete as well. But I see that this kind of mentions the two pieces, the kind of the using it in city projects and then also creating incentives to encourage developers to use it. And I know you mentioned that would make sense for a city to start using it first, and then that could create a model and create that incentive for developers as well. But is it already included in some of the incentives for developers that may exist with like the points rating system that we talked about previously, where they can get points for building in a way that's more sustainable developments? Is low carbon concrete one of the potential ways they can get like a point for that?
When you refer to the points, are you referring to when we talked about the MUPT program and getting points for like green building?
Yeah, I know that's being considered right now. So I don't know what the status of that is, but yeah, I wasn't sure if there's any other programs like the MUPT.
No, we don't really have any other kind of just general incentive programs like that one was. So no, we haven't used low carbon concrete again, because it's kind of hard to say like what is like low carbon concrete is not a thing. That's a thing that we have to define still. So that's why we can't just be like, hey, like in order to get to that second part of that strategy of actually encouraging developers, there's just so much to do in terms of figuring out like, you know, what do we consider low carbon concrete for Bend? And so that's in the Portland area. They were kind of figuring that out for themselves. And they, at the time, they were not actually looking for trying to encourage that in private development. They were focused solely on city-led capital projects. So I don't think there's anyone else who's actually trying to encourage that in private development, but it's a little bit trickier because it's not like saying, you know, go use like an Energy Star appliance or some sort of, it's not like there's a category, it's not like developers just know what that means. That's stuff that we have to define, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I almost feel like for me, especially being part of the waste materials working group, I feel like I need to learn more about this. So I wonder if at some point it might make sense to like do like an informational like meeting or have someone like help us understand more about what low carbon concrete means, because it's the action specifically calls that out, but it sounds like you're saying it, we also define it. It's not a category, it's not a product in its own category by default. So I would like to learn more about it to know how we can fulfill this action.
Yeah, well, when I, you know, my intention was to reconnect with the DEQ staff, and they have a new staff person who's in charge of that. So that's something that we can schedule as a whole working group meeting rather than just me, if that would be of interest, or if I can just send it out to the working group and whoever's interested in joining.
That sounds good.
And I'll also add that I think indirectly, low carbon materials and concrete is often identified as one of the highest targets in embodied carbon in materials, are identified in a lot of green building programs. So although not directly incentivized, any private developer or any program that would try to encourage or require a certain level of Earth Advantage or LEED or one of those types of programs would usually have a category where somebody might be able to get points for low carbon concrete. So although not directly incentivized or promoted through this goal, it might be buried in some green building certification point systems.
Okay, thank you.
That,
yeah, well, it actually it made me wonder, is there any action directly in CCAP that has something to do with green building, or I know there's energy in buildings kind of category, but is there more about the building materials itself?
low carbon concrete.
Okay.
Embodied carbon is really like, it's kind of a growing direction and like hasn't been as much of a focus. So I know like at the state level, it is something that is just like, there was a bill that was passed last year to DEQ has an embodied carbon program, but actually implementing that into building code, and evaluating building code for things that might be more carbon based than just kilowatt hour or therm reduction based. So moving kind of more towards carbon than energy, is something that was a study requirement in a bill last year. So it's kind of an emerging field. And concrete was identified as a material specifically earlier on in the process. So that's why that material is being focused on first.
Okay. And I guess just to add kind of my thought process as you were sharing some of that is that we're going to talk about the CCAP update process, I guess, in the next agenda item. But it almost sounds like green building kind of overall, if that's not currently in CCAP and low carbon concrete is part of it, but maybe there's also like potential to look at the larger piece of that as well as part of the CCAP update process, if that makes sense. Especially, I think I'm just thinking because Bend has so much development, feels like a big opportunity area.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on what Cassie said, I think the city does a lot of projects. I mean, we self-perform our own curb ramps and we do a lot of bike ped, a lot of concrete goes into city work. And if the city were going to have a criteria when we do RFPs for scoring projects this would go down to the sub level, right? There would be a contract that would go out and this would be some sub work. We would have to know what is our standard. So it sounds like getting data. What do we do now? My guess is that we maybe let the subs decide, or I don't know, this will be a standards and specs questions. What is in our standards and specs for the concrete criteria for building sidewalks and curbs, which are part of numerous projects? That would probably be, before we start to impose something on developers, they're going to say, well, what do you do for your many, many, many projects with geo bonds, with STC funding? We do so many. What is our standard now? What is, if you're going to impose it, you have to have some criteria because we score those projects. So that would be the next step to figure out what are other cities doing and what criteria are out there that you all could propose that the city look at. It's a purchasing question, it's an engineering question, but it starts with a knowledge, which is kind of your role in helping the city get to.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mary. And the first step is really saying like, well, because we don't have a standard for it. So it's like, well, what have we been using? And it is something that kind of impartially needs to be figured out city by city, because I think Portland's the only city who has kind of set a standard for themselves, but because the concrete mixes that are appropriate are kind of climate dependent, I don't know that we would necessarily want to just, we wouldn't necessarily want to just take the standards used elsewhere, because we want to make sure that those are also going to work here too.
And there's models. We've had discussions on what do we use for snow removal? What are the materials environmentally for landscaping? And this has come up at the council level, directing public works staff on what are environmentally better ways to do city work. So the engineering department is used to having to look at practices that they've been doing forever. Well, let's look at what you're doing, but it definitely starts with like understanding what it is and what's out there to change and what's the cost and, what does it do to the bottom line of the project.
I just want to highlight, in my experience, this is an incredibly risk-averse community. But having said that, this could have enormous potential impact, and that companies, cities are setting these standards, and something that we should look to prioritize, and that there are standards that we can build that look comprehensively, both at cost as well as maintenance and others. But having those data points will be helpful in ensuring progression in terms of implementation of our standards.
Thankfully, one of the other things I learned is that the lower carbon mixes actually tend to be cost effective or even sometimes more affordable, just because the carbon intensive part of concrete is the cement. And so the lower carbon, which is also the costly part of concrete. So the lower carbon mixes generally use less cement and more other materials. And so not 100% of the time, but a lot of times they're either similar cost or lower cost. So that, again, that was as of 2 years ago, and I discussed it with the DEQ last. That's what they were reporting. But definitely something we'd want to look at closely.
And understanding the materials that make up these recipes and helping to establish that pipeline within the city or the county will have a cascading effect. So once cities implement these sort of standards, we see sort of general adoption more broadly because of the cost impact and the way the concrete sets. And so again, just as we're thinking about potential impacts, we should also be aware of the opportunity to bring these types of other materials into like the localized supply chain will have, you know, a much broader effect across the construction industry. So that was our last slide. Any other questions about the activities we undertook, prioritization, strategy kind of in general?
I had a quick question about, I think it was your third recommended action, which was targeting certain industries for waste reduction. Do we have any information or data on like the biggest contributors, whether it's sectors or specific businesses or entities, that sort of thing?
I will say we haven't done a deep dive, and that was kind of one of our next steps. We didn't want to go too far into it early on without doing the prioritization of all of the areas that it entailed. I will say that there has been work done with, you know, what Bend is known for in terms of beverage manufacturing, you know, beer specifically, and then food and some agricultural. Just looking at our greenhouse gas emissions and that kind of stuff, we can use that as kind of a target for highest impact, knowing Bend a little bit. But there's also a lot of programs and potential partners out there that we need to talk to and get a better understanding. And obviously, construction is part of that too. So, you know, the building community and whatnot. So don't have an answer for you. We have a lot more to do, but that's kind of where we're starting.
I thought the county was doing a waste characterization study of the landfill, but I haven't heard the latest on that. So we'll follow. Do you know, Serena?
No, I was just agreeing with you. I know that they have some of that stuff in the works too, and that's when we met with them a while ago. That was kind of something on our radar to follow up with as well.
Yeah.
So between them and the DEQ and some of these other entities that we've been continually following, that's kind of where we're starting to get. We don't want to, you know, do what they've already been doing. We want to understand kind of those next steps.
And the waste characterization study will give us helpful data, but it won't, the ones I've seen don't typically identify specific companies, but may help us to narrow down industries. So getting that to that next level, or maybe we don't need to, maybe we're just setting standards like by industry. So there's a lot to be figured out in this space. And maybe we just start with the low hanging fruit of like who's open to these conversations, what standards are we seeing implemented in industries, and how do we help kind of reinforce those. But these are all the discussions that will be on the tables, probably kicking off on that March 12th meeting.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Kelly, on that. We already know some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the industries that are already working together on certain things. So that's probably a good place to start. Low impact, or you know, high impact, low potential work to help contribute and be a partner.
And I think that conversation just sparked another idea. I don't know if the action specifically talks about this or that we've talked about it, but as part of that, I think there could be a lot of opportunity, but bringing many of the members or businesses within that industry together to kind of also like share best practices or just lessons on how they learn to be more sustainable. And I feel like the city could play some kind of leadership role in like creating some kind of guides for those industries as well. So in addition to kind of the workforce training piece, I feel like there's probably some opportunities to just use that role and be a leader in just assembling information that is compiled from members of that industry, but then make it easily accessible for basically everyone in the industry as a potential opportunity. I do want to share one thing that struck me when Kelly, you covered the first opportunity or the first strategy that we're working on, the education and outreach piece, and especially the sustainability hub that was mentioned. And we did talk about this in our working group, but just to share with the full committee as well. I think that hub especially would be incorporating all the areas of CCAP. So I think that could be a really good opportunity. Right now, there is a sustainability page in the city of Bend's website that has some information on like the different on CCAP itself, but also like energy and certain things, but it's more so what the city is doing. And I think the opportunity we discussed and that I see personally as well is having something that could be like a guide for all residents in Bend to go to be like, what can I do? Like, what are some steps I can take on the energy side, on the transportation side, on the waste and materials side to be more sustainable? So that could be really a good, and we have also talked about collaborating with other sectors on that one pager and some of the communications on education and outreach. So I think that is one of the areas where it would make sense to kind of create the content for each sector, but then still collaborate on the dissemination of that information.
Yeah, we've talked about this I talked about it with the 2 working groups, and most of you were covered under those discussions. But I think our plan is, since both the energy group and the waste group have a similar vision for this kind of information hub on the website, and then from there, specific energy messaging and specific waste and materials messaging. But there's kind of, I think for both of you, that involves partially just an overarching messaging about our climate work and in general. And so our plan is for the March meeting to invite our communications director in, and she'll share a little bit about just communication options we have at the city and how we can all partner together. But she also has this creative brief process that she does where she actually helps. She runs this with departments. So she's offered to come do this with the committee, where we can actually kind of start talking together and start framing the messaging and kind of the messages and the things we want to say and how we want to be saying them. That will inform kind of the big picture of that information hub on the website. So that is, we'll talk about it at agenda review, but that's kind of what we have planned for our March meeting, is to really just dig into that, since it's clearly high interest for a majority of the committee members across the working groups. And it's just kind of the foundational work we need to do in order to make progress on all the education and outreach actions that you all are interested in all those working groups as well.
And I just want to mention one thing. A lot of the actions that we talked about today for our waste and materials subgroup can kind of be aligned with funding opportunities that will come out of the Recycling Modernization Act. And so we just want to make sure that our timelines for implementing actions kind of line up with those funding cycles as we move forward. But it's good timing for us.
Great. Are there any other questions for the Waste and Materials group? Thanks for, as always, having very good process and presentation of your group's work. So, yeah, excited to see what we can move forward with those goals. All right, it's 11:45, a little after 11:45, and we have 2 other agenda items: natural gas policy CCAP update process and the Covey with the tree code update letter. So unless anybody has any objections timing wise, let's eat lunch now quickly, and then we'll come back in 6.5 minutes. At 11:54.5. All right, we hopefully have successfully unmuted. If you're online and can hear
You
us.
have.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm not gonna make that mistake again.
Always good to check.
That was a great 11-minute long, 6.5-minute long break. So thanks everybody. So we were just saying that knowing the opportunity, or basically our two agenda items, one is long and one is short. So we were we're considering a 10-minute tree code update. So then we can use the rest of our time for the natural gas and CCAP update process. Does that work for you all? Basically, does that work for you, Cassie?
Yes, as long as the tree code actually is a shorter update, that would be good. There's always the risk of, what you talk about first, you just have more time for.
Yeah.
Versus what you leave to the end.
So we have until 12:10 and then we're gonna have to move on.
And we might not need that whole time, but yeah, anyway, that sounds good
Yeah, we
for me,
can always
but
come
just be
back.
mindful of the time, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I will just share. So, just to kind of give a little bit quick, we discussed this in multiple meetings in the past. I think one of the things we decided was to come to this meeting with a letter specifically ready, to share with either the planning commission and or city council regarding the recommendations. But because I think all the conversation has been pretty short, I don't think there was like a actual opportunity for everyone to learn all the stuff about the tree code update and also see if there was support for that specifically for that change. So I sent that memo and after the meeting. I apologize that there wasn't more time to review that, but hopefully you all had the chance to skim it at least. But I'll just share that on the screen and maybe just walk through some of the key pieces and then just see if there's support or any questions. So we can keep it pretty short today. So this is the full memo. The summary basically talks about it is the main piece of this is that the recommendation includes a 20% priority tree preservation standard, which I think falls short. And that 25 would be a better choice. And then I tried to back that up with some data on why I think it falls short. So I'll share mainly focus on that piece of it. But just as a reminder, again, you're all the different options. It's kind of a flow chart. I say kind of because all those options are available at any time. So I don't necessarily see it as flow chart, but the idea is that the first option is more attractive than the second option and so forth down the flow chart. Okay, so like I said, I'll focus on just the data I shared and why I think it falls short. And really the main piece is as part of the tree code, we had data for 8 recent developments shared with us that the tree code apply to. And based on those 8 developments, which is not it's like a statistically it's just the data that was available for the most recent 8 developments, which I tried to base it out because that was the best data available to us. But for that, it came out to that the preservation rate was 24%. And so that by itself, I think going to 20%, especially I think one of the concerns that created True Act was that there were community concerns that a lot of trees, especially large trees, were being cut in the process of developments. And so if the purpose is to address some of those concerns, I don't know if that accomplishes it, if the actual standard is lower than what happened in the recent developments. I do want to acknowledge that basically, if the 20% was applied for all the developments across the board for those 8 developments, it would be 29 trees would have been preserved, and actually 33 trees were preserved. So if you're just expecting developers to do the bare minimum, then it does fall short just based on numbers. If we do assume that the current developments still did the same that they had done, then only 3 developments would save more, which would save an additional 8 trees. Which in terms of if you look at it that way, that would be about 6% more preservation. Looking at 25, I will share this real quick. So if we did 25% priority tree preservation, again, 4 out of the 8 already meet that. Those are these green boxes right here. And then the fifth one is basically half a tree or one tree away from meeting that. And so I think it's still reasonable, it's still doable, and that would end up preserving 10% more priority trees. Yeah, I think I want to keep it short. So I think that's the main thing I wanted to share. And then the other piece I just want to share, I did update this list. There were some other recommendations that TRUAC also through all of our meetings that came up, some of them multiple times. And many of them were seen just as important as the code itself to make sure that trees are preserved. And some of them have potential in other ways to help preserve more trees. So those were also included in the recommendation to City Council, and that'll be shared with the Planning Commission as well. But just again, I think if we do write some letter to just again call it out specifically to make sure those are not ignored, just for the code piece, and that it's not just focused on simply the code piece.
Just an update, these other recommendation at the mayor's request, what was presented last night hasn't broken into 3 categories now.
Okay.
The first category is what is already being done, what could be in the this biennium, and then the third category. So just look at the update on the PowerPoint presentation. Also, we have a projected schedule that May 15th would be the council work session on the tree code, with the first reading June 5th and the second reading June 20th. The date's a little changed because of the June 9th, the Juneteenth holiday. I don't have the planning commission date, but any comments would go into the public record for those hearings. So just so you know, which is a little bit of time. There's going to be public outreach. There's going to be 2 question and answer sessions that were approved by council last night.
Okay.
And we'll let you know when those are.
Thank you for those updates, Mary. Yeah, and I Cassie, you had shared that email for the Planning Commission schedule. I think it was March, potentially March, April.
Yeah, they're now waiting until after the question and answer sessions.
Okay.
We need to get those scheduled and then have the Planning Commission. So it was just, that's why everything was pushed out a little bit.
So there might be more time
Might
potentially.
be April would
Okay.
probably be more realistic.
Cool. So if we do decide to draft a letter, there's time. So we have until basically we have time. Any questions? Did that cover it with the memo? I don't know if there were any gaps in terms of what I covered. The one piece I will actually say that's a gap in what I covered in the memo is I mainly focus on the priority tree because that was one of the goals of preserving larger trees specifically. Because there are 4 options, if we decide to go from 20 to 25% for priority trees, the total diameter at breast height DBH piece of that, let me just pull that up on the screen so you can see it, is, sorry, so this piece right here, so there's right now it's 20% of priority trees and 25% of the DBH for all inventory trees. The reason that is higher is to, again, try and incentivize the priority trees. So if we did change the 20%, I think it would make sense to then increase that in one step as well to 30%. And those are some of the options TRUAC had looked at. And I had proposed that amendment, but TRUAC failed, I think 6 to 7 or so in the final meeting where we voted on. So it came pretty close. So that's one piece I didn't spend a lot of time covering, but I think it makes sense to increase that hand in hand. And then the other 2 pieces, the replaced on site, those ratios were already decided. I think those would probably still make sense. But the fee in lieu, I don't know if this was presented further, Mary, but that was going to be created by city staff. So I have no idea where that lies and how they're making sure that incentivizes the other pieces. So it's not something where developers can just pay their way out of following this, make it easy for them to pay their way out of it. Okay. Okay.
Can you go back to the table with the green and the yellow boxes?
Yeah.
So you were talking about like 4 out of the 5, but then there's like 8 projects in total. Can you just talk about the ones that don't have green boxes?
Yeah, so those are the ones that would actually be impacted by the code in terms of they'll have to do something additional, either change their plans in terms of how they could potentially save the trees, or do the other options of replace on site or pay a fee in lieu. So So for 20%, these three would be impacted, but 25%, these three, and potentially this one would be impacted. So it mainly shows that the percentages were fairly reasonable. There was not like 0 out of 8 are meeting them. Even the 30%, 4 out of 8 or 3.5 out of 4, 3.5 out of 8 were meeting them too. And then that's where I got the total amount of how many additional trees would be saved. And I did a little bit of like this gets a little detailed, but this is how I got the 24% of and how much additional trees would be saved at different percentages right here.
Debbie, my one sort of question about raising the percentages as you have sort of proposed to 25 and 30 is so we know that a big issue and point of contention in this whole process of tree preservation is the needed housing statute, and that local governments can't have regulations that unreasonably impede the provision of
Unreasonable cost and delay.
unreasonable cost and delay. Thank you, Mary. Was there any discussion at TRUAC or advice from staff about whether increasing these percentages, that 5% that you've outlined, would create a greater risk along those lines that we should know about?
They're squishy topics.
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's
Corey and
unreasonable, it's-
Corey from Landwatch and Jeff, a developer, the chair, were there last night. And they both, I thought, did a really good job of explaining this was a compromise. Neither side was particularly happy. The developers don't like these numbers. They don't like the 1 acre. They want a 2 acre minimum. Some of the environmental folks on the group thought that the numbers should be higher, wanted 0.5 for minimum acreages. So it was absolutely a compromise. And they repeatedly talked about cost and delay on a multitude of areas. We've been to DLCD on that topic, and it's now at the Court of Appeals, so there is still law to be made. I mean, if you follow the HVAC discussion, trees has come up. It's just one of those areas that it's a judgment call.
Yeah.
It's an important value. Council definitely gets it. There's still like, what's the line that we don't have a particularly perfect answer, which in some ways is why compromise is a good thing.
Yeah.
But people can draw the line in different places, and then we're here to defend whatever council decides.
Right. Yeah, so what's unreasonable is
Yeah.
about the most subjective standard you could come up with. Yeah, I really like the analysis you did there, Kevin, to like show what upping those percentages a little bit would do. To me, that doesn't seem unreasonable. So I'm in favor. I don't know if we're voting yet, but that's
Yeah.
where I'm at.
That is the first question, just in the interest of time. If everyone's comfortable moving to that first decision point of if there's support for increasing the priority tree standard to 25%. I don't know if you need to do a show of hands or. Yeah, I don't know how to.
Yeah, and I would encourage you to go to the question and answer sessions if any of you are interested to hear more from the committee and staff on what decisions were made and why. Just because to be effective as commenting, I think it would be good for the committee to have engaged in that part of the process. There is some time.
Yeah, with our time today and knowing the time of when action would need to happen, would it be okay to delay a vote? So then we can dig in and have more conversation if we need to, since this is the first time we've seen the actual, or I know it's sent, but.
The question is when the planning commission hearings are, because
Yeah.
if they happen, if they're too close to when we meet next,
Oh, that's
then we
true.
might have to leave a letter drafted.
Yeah.
Into the record there.
I mean, I want to be careful of not taking too more time than needed from the committee, but if there's like concerns or if people are not in agreement, then I think I'm open to it, but just knowing that we've talked about a couple of meetings and this is like the 3rd time, so I just don't want to keep taking time on our limited time from our meetings, unless there's strong interest in that. And also acknowledging that I was part of TRUAC, I was one member of this committee, and so like it's important to me, and I'm guessing important to many of us, but it's not part of CCAP specifically, so like also acknowledging the balance of how much time I want to spend on it.
Yeah, I'm mostly just saying we're
Oh,
already
for
5
today.
minutes over.
Yeah.
So we might
Can
be
we-
able to come back to it if we have time at the end, but if there's gonna be deliberation, I think it's gonna be hard.
Okay, is there interest in just a quick vote, or do we want time for deliberation?
Can I perhaps propose a compromise, which
Yeah.
is a quick vote to see if there's support? If there is, we can draft a letter and then vote again to
I like that.
agree to submit it to the planning commission next time, just so we are making
So we
progress.
have, yeah,
So just support for drafting a letter, not approving the letter right now. Is that?
Sure, yeah, my only comment or concern is just I thought we were going to be more focused on the other recommendations when we had talked about this, just because we hadn't been as involved in all of the components of the original recommendation. So that's my own kind of personal commentary or bias.
like
Rather than all
expanding
the
on that.
decisions being about the 25%, rather than supporting and putting some weight behind the other recommendations piece.
I guess I'll just go through this real quick. So is there support for increasing the priority tree standard to 25%? And then sorry, Neil, to address yours, I think there's still, I'm open to that, to room for that and as part of the letter, like expanding on some of that. But I do think that will require more conversation and deliberation, which I know we don't have a lot of time for. So I just want to first just make sure there's support from the committee as a whole before we spend any more time on this for increasing the priority tree standard, as I put it in the memo, to 25%. Can we just?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't see online people, but any no's or, okay, Smita's a yes. That seems like a majority at least.
We were talking,
Okay.
are we willing to continue to entertain the discussion?
And then we can,
Yeah.
okay, and then should I just see if there's interest in drafting or someone's interested in helping me draft that letter, and then we can come back next meeting and have more deliberation on it? Don't jump all at once.
I feel like you've done all the hard work in this.
I can take a first stab at it if someone wants to. I just haven't drafted a lot of letters like that to like city council, planning commission. So on the format or structure of it, if someone wants to be a sounding board for me. I can also check with Cassie or the chair and vice chair.
I'll work on it with you, Kevin.
Thank you, Rory.
Yep.
All right. Does that seem like a good place to leave it?
Yeah.
With everybody? Okay. Thanks, Neil.
Yep. Okay. Kathy, you're up.
Okay, thanks. And Covey, can you unshare? Because it's not letting me reshare.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so next we want to talk about, we have two processes that we are going to be working on this year as a committee. They're separate processes and I put them into one memo, but they're distinct enough that we'll talk about them separately. So the first is the natural gas policy options process. So what, as you know, we've been asked to go to the council in March on this topic specifically and propose to them a process that we'll go through in order to recommend to them policies and strategies to reduce natural gas in buildings. And so we've been kind of brainstorming what this might look like. And we have two options that we are planning on bringing to the counselors in March. And so I just wanted all your feedback on what those processes are and what you think about them. And so as we've been thinking about what this looks like, there's kind of two elements to it, which is that, before I even get to that slide, because there's a lot of words on it. First is that we have a lot of just information gathering and information finding and analyzing that we feel like we need to do as staff in order to even wrap our heads around this topic better, and certainly to get to the point where we feel like we can make good recommendations, whether our recommendations are going straight to the council or to you all as a committee or to another committee. So we have kind of this information gathering and an analysis piece. A big part of the information and analysis includes definitely a lot of stakeholder engagement. So actually talking to impacted industries in Bend, hearing from both the gas and the electric utilities. And so doing a lot of engagement with the stakeholders, but then so that's kind of the analysis part of it. But then in addition to that, we know we need to do public engagement as well. Because it's, of course, we do public engagement for all of our, any, major city policy, and knowing that this is one that there's a high level of interest in and will ultimately affect people who live here. And so you'll see the steps that we have kind of broken out. We have kind of, I think that analysis part of it kind of stays the same between the two of them, because that's just the fundamental information that we need to get, and we need to understand about what different programs and policies related to natural gas, what they'll actually look like in Bend, what the impact will be, both on from a carbon perspective, but also costs and other types of impacts. So we really feel like we need to do that in both of them. And then the thing that varies in our two approaches is the type of community engagement that we do for that. And so the first one is kind of our stakeholder committee or task force approach. So this would be a more community engagement heavy approach, where we're actually appointing a committee, kind of like a TRUAC committee, maybe not as formal as TRUAC, but we would be putting together a stakeholder committee that would be involve members from the ECC, but it would be outside of the ECC. And we would be convening several committee meetings that would start at the beginning of that analysis process, so that that committee would actually be helping, even before the analysis started, they would be able to provide a little bit more input into the scope of that analysis, and making sure that the analysis is answering all the questions that the committee members have. We would do the analysis, and then that committee would hear the results of the analysis, and then the committee itself would actually move to develop a recommendation for the council. So I have kind of mapped a timeline for how I think that would work. And I think the first advisory committee in that case would happen in June. Between April and May, we would be, setting up the committee, procuring the consultant, and kind of getting it all up and running. And then we would have the first meeting in June. The analysis would happen through the summer, kind of June through September. The stakeholder interviews as part of that analysis would be happening during the summer. So we'd be doing engagement, but no committee meetings in the later part of the summer. And then once the analysis was done, we would have a second advisory committee meeting in October, and then third and fourth advisory committee meetings in October and November, where they'd be actually developing the recommendation. And then that would have us going to the council to, so I have the fourth advisory. I was thinking it would take 2 to 3 advisory committee meetings after we had the analysis done to actually hear the results and then develop a recommendation and get consensus on that, or agreement on that recommendation, so that we would be bringing the recommendation to council probably at the beginning of 2025. And then from there, of course, there will be further stakeholder engagement on the next step, depending on what the recommendations are. So that's kind of option one. And then the council had also asked us to give an option for a more expedited version of the natural gas policy options process. And like I said, we really feel like the analysis just can't be rushed, because that's information gathering, but the level of public engagement can really affect how long or short something can get done. And so the other option we have does not involve the committee. So what we would do is we would first just hire the consultant, and we'd be able to start the analysis a little bit earlier, because we don't need to also go through the step of standing up a committee. The analysis would run from kind of May until August. And we would, if we don't have another stakeholder committee, we would rely more on the ECC, whether that's the full committee or the natural gas subgroup, to just provide some input into the scope of the analysis and helping us determine that initial list of policies to consider. And then we would still be doing stakeholder interviews in this version. So we would be engaging key stakeholders. And then that analysis could be done in September, and then we could develop a recommendation in September. That would probably be a recommendation that was kind of a combination of staff and ECC. I think in that model, it would be a staff recommendation, most likely, that we would bring to the ECC for feedback. And then we could also, this is a question we'll ask the council if they wanted this faster version, is that we could do a broader community engagement after the analysis is done. So in the September timeframe, which might be a town hall, or it might be a couple of info sessions that's kind of done at the end of the analysis, where we're just showing the results and we're kind of sharing what we think the staff recommendation will be. And then we can deliver the recommendation to council and get their feedback earlier, like I think as early as October. I have the optional community engagement. I think I just meant to do that before the council direction. So those are kind of the two options that we've put forward for the natural gas process. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious to hear if you all think that there's like a different approach we should be taking on that process altogether, or if really any feedback you have. This is not meant to be like an exhaustive list of stakeholders. This is really just to kind of meant to orient you to the actual process we'll go through. So I guess I'm curious before we get to the CCAP to hear what you have on that.
I had a clarifying question, Cassie, for the first option.
Yep.
It mentions the procure consultant and schedule committee meeting for April and May. And then basically, is that consultant then still working through with that committee as well and providing kind of helpful information and the analysis? I don't know, are they providing some kind of report or some kind of information to the committee then throughout the process?
Yeah, exactly. So the consultant support will be hired in both versions. They're going to be the ones that we've gone over kind of the scope of that analysis in previous meetings, but they'll be looking at, we'll have kind of a menu of different policy options and programs related to reducing reliance on natural gas. And they'll be able to do an analysis on what is the carbon impact of this, and what are the different other potential impacts and outcomes that we need to be aware of. And then as part of that analysis, we'll also have our legal team do a legal analysis of the different options. So that's going to be the same in both of these two options. We'll hire the same consultant with the same scope of work, but in this committee option, we would have that committee would be receiving the full report from that consultant. So they would be more involved in the analysis stage. Where in the second one, that would be scoped and it would be targeted mainly to staff in conjunction with getting feedback from you all in the natural gas group.
The committee that would be formed in the first option, is that sort of like building a new committee from scratch, or is that a subset of ECC?
No, this one, the idea here was that we would, it would be like a new committee that would be like an ad hoc task force. So that's why it's similar to the TRUAC, where we would kind of identify stakeholders that we feel like are relevant to this topic that the council wanted to appoint on that committee. So it would include representatives from the ECC, but it would also be other people.
Yeah, under city code, we've done this numerous times. It's a temporary or ad hoc committee and council forms it. Some are permanent committees like you are in our code. Temporary committees are formed by resolution where council says, this is what we want them to do. So we've done it.
I figured it was that. I just wanted to clarify what kind of committee it was.
Because this version with the that doesn't have that committee, I do envision us because the ECC was so interested in this, we would be sharing back to the ECC to you all still on this topic in this process, but it wouldn't be part of the actual analysis and recommendation process as much, if that makes sense.
Am I interpreting this right? Or kind of my interpretation of of a significant difference is relying on stakeholder interviews more so in option 2 to shape a recommendation rather than having a kind of super broad table without as clear of a direction of which direction you're going. And so my general inclination is that the second one seems like a good way of still having that robust engagement opportunity, but using a consultant to try to help take all of those pieces in with the recommendations of outside stakeholders, inside stakeholders, working with legal staff. So then you can actually come up with a product that then can be, we can figure out like through more engagement what the implementation of it looks like, rather than having to do the brainstorming, the analysis and scoping, and then end up with a product that then you still have to do that kind of further analysis on once it gets kind of further down the funnel.
One thing I would encourage you to think about is when this topic just started to percolate in the community, council started to get a lot of emails, a barrage of emails from various interest groups that were concerned. Reaching out to stakeholders is a more potentially private process, so that people that want to watch and know what you're doing may not feel engaged. I understand that a stakeholder process in the committee can seem more cumbersome, but it's public. So people can come, they can watch, they can listen to what you're considering, they can have documents in front of them. If you do something that is perceived as not as open and transparent, you just have to understand how that perception can be to the community on a topic that many people will care about immensely. Other communities have done quite big processes that, I mean, we've been tracking what's going on in other communities. I have files on this already, and they have generally been quite public processes that I've seen out there.
Isn't it true that most of the communities in Oregon at least have also had a much narrower request that they've been starting those processes with? Like, this is our goal, we need to find a policy to get there, not just we need to reduce gas use in general. Like, they've been very narrow, we're looking for different ways to do XYZ, but a narrower request of those groups.
I think Eugene started pretty broad and then backed off after the Berkeley decision. We're tracking Ashland, which like in June of 2023 had a very broad goal, but what they just posted, which we thought there was going to be something in their meeting this week. And it turned out that the ordinance in front of them was to ban gas-powered leaf blowers, which they said was step 1 on their big goal. So look like they're taking it step by step. So, you know, in Oregon, it looks like there are some that everybody's watching the litigation and watching like, what can they do when, I mean, Seattle's, Chicago, a lot of cities are doing workarounds now to actual bans. But I don't know that they've been that narrow. I think some have just decided where can we start with which piece of it? Some just done multifamily and commercial, some have focused on residential first.
And has that happened through a broad stakeholder group making that? I'm asking a question. I'm basically making a statement.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen much narrower, jumping into a big stakeholder process with a narrower request of once they've said, we want to look at multifamily strategies, we want to look at these strategies. I think that that's where a very open and public conversation can happen. But I think that starting broader than that is, I don't think not that it's trying to hide anything. I think you need to have slightly more direction. And so this was where I was encouraged, because we haven't had it, at least from my read, it seemed like a more broad request that we're starting out with. And it seemed like kind of a hairy goal to address in that way. Yeah.
That might be step 1 of a 2-step process.
Yeah, so maybe that's,
That way, that's what I.
the
just think
bottom half of
community
that.
Wants to know
Yeah.
that there will be a process.
absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe we can outline that, the kind of where it sits in the longer context, if it's like the beginning of a two-step process and how other people will be engaged. To answer your original question, Neil, I actually was still envisioning doing the stakeholder interviews in the committee model, just because we need to do those just to do the analysis by itself. And I guess there would be, depending on how the committee is structured, there would be some overlap in the committee and the stakeholders that need to be interviewed. So I guess we would need to be thoughtful of that. Like, how do we define that, and how do we make sure we're getting, the type of feedback we want to during the stakeholder interviews and not during the public committee meetings, and vice versa. Though I think at a certain point, there just may be overlap with them, and we would just, hear things twice, which is completely fair too. So, but I think it's a good point. Like, I think I was picturing doing it still, but making sure that we're delineating like the function of those two steps clearly, so that it just doesn't get confusing.
I had a question too, but I'm just trying to think of like the workload piece of it, and it does seem like the first one. I guess my question is, if that committee is formed, is that something you would be leading, Cassie, in terms of just like your workload and juggling that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful to know.
With legal, legal will be heavily involved in either option.
And I'm not part of the energy working group, but I think what I was going to share is just my personal, I think I agree with some of what Mary shared, is that having been on TRUAC, I think when we are dealing with more contentious topics of the city, it is nice to have a broader committee that has some of those voices be part of that process to learn about ways it would impact them, and maybe ways to like address some of those concerns early on through that whole process, versus it being politically fraught or more contentious when something is decided. So I know it takes a little bit longer. It sounds like between October of this year versus January of next year. So it's like a slower process, and it might be weakened from what I think we would want maybe on the climate side. But I do think it would end up with a policy that would be more sustainable, and like end up hopefully getting the more community buy-in, and yeah, that ends up not being so contentious as a policy itself once it's formed. But I do think even like how the committee is formed, from my perspective, would make sense either for all or most of the energy working group to be part of that committee. And then I think like how Mary mentioned it with TRUAC, it was a compromise. And like I said, some of the amendments from the environmental side that were to make it stronger failed with 6 to 7 because of how the committee was, how many different voices they had with different things they were looking for. So I feel like there's still an ability to consider those voices, but still make sure it's something that is advancing our objectives on the climate side.
And you all don't need to make a decision or a recommendation related to this, because this is going to be the council's decision. So I'd like to start moving on, just so we can talk about the CCAP as well. But is there interest from that natural gas group? Do you all want to chat about this more? Because I can pull together a working group to talk about this more, particularly kind of going into the work session, and also hearing from you if you all want an opportunity to share something during that work session.
Be interested.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to participate.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll try to just convene that group once in the next couple of weeks, if that sounds good.
And can I just make one more comment, which I think will help us transition to two pieces. One, I agree with Kavi in terms of the open process, and one piece of that in particular is a larger window of input when you're framing what's going to be in the analysis. Because otherwise you could be in a position where you have to go back and reopen the analysis because people are upset you didn't analyze a particular option anyway. But in terms of looking at the timelines of these two, I am curious how it dovetails with CCAP, and so maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Transition.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna try to explain. I don't want to go through like each month by month timeline since you guys have it in the memo, and it just gets confusing when you're trying to read that. But when I was thinking about the CCAP process, I kind of saw it as these 6 phases, which is that, you know, first we'll kind of familiarize ourselves with the progress that we've made to date. We need to refine the existing actions list of the CCAP. We need to add new actions to the CCAP. Then we need to evaluate and prioritize those actions, as well as reevaluate within the new context the old actions and prioritizing the old actions. And then once we have kind of that action list complete, then we want to start also getting further with our work planning and coming up with the resource requests, as we've talked about. And so as far as the process for this goes, each of those steps, mainly the adding and the prioritizing actions and the work planning, we can either do as a whole committee or we can break up into the working groups. And so the main feedback I want from you all is to what extent you all want to work in the working groups for as many of those things as possible, or if you'd rather be in the full committee for as many of those things as possible, or if there's like one you feel really strongly about doing in the working group and the other ones you think would be good to do in the full committee. And I mapped out the timelines mainly in an attempt to see if taking the full committee approach or the working group approach, if one was significantly faster than the other. And I don't actually think they are faster than the other. As we know from our previous work, the benefit of the working groups is that you can really get into the content more specifically, but the downside is that typically it involves taking an extra step of reporting back to the whole committee, which kind of slows things down on that end. The full committee, you can kind of just, since you're all there for all the discussions, there's less time spent reporting back. However, it's harder to get really deep into a topic, or it just takes tons and tons of time if, you know, the whole committee is going to try to address a topic. And I will also say that the timelines that I put forward, I believe are an extremely optimistic version of the timeline, but I didn't want to put something out there that looked like it was going to take 1.5 to 2 years. Because even the timeline I put out, you know, I have us having a committee meeting dedicated to, you know, brainstorming new actions for 2 sectors and having that take place in a single meeting. So I'm, you know, I think we all need to think about if that feels realistic. Like for the CCAP update, we can talk about energy and transportation and do a whole update in one meeting in terms of new actions. So the other thing is that we definitely are going to want to do a community survey as part of that. So that was kind of what I put in here, because for community engagement is having some sort of community survey, which I was seeing as some sort of virtual option, and we can maybe do some pop-up events in the community to make sure that survey is getting out for places. So I saw doing that closer to the end, kind of sharing people what those new ideas are and getting kind of feedback near the end for. So that was the one other step that I guess isn't outlined in the phased approach. And then both options have it being a roughly 1-year process. I think we can start, unless you guys feel like you'd like to postpone the start in order to make time for your other actions that we're working on, because definitely, you know, we do have a lot of stuff that you all wanted to start working on. I had us starting as soon as May, which I did because I know that I know that there's a desire to kind of get going and not put things back. So I'm curious to hear if you think starting as soon as May and just getting this underway also so that we can do some of this before we can have an idea of what direction we're going before we do goal setting and budget for next year, or if you guys would rather have us just push back the whole start so that you have more time to work on your other things and we would have more time for the natural gas process to play out. I think we can do them concurrently with just a little bit of awkwardness that we would work through little by little. So are there any thoughts, questions? I don't want to go, I have like slides of these month by month, but I don't think you would all need me to read that, to read through that, because this was kind of a potential schedule as it is, since the, you know, the actual timelines may get off as we start going.
I can start off with a thought. I think I'm initially in favor of doing it by committee. Because those committees are kind of well organized right now. We already have meetings on the books. We have momentum, I suppose.
You mean the
And-
working groups?
What's that?
You mean the working groups?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
sorry, yeah, right, not full committee, they're smaller. And it frees up more time in our regular full committee meetings to do other stuff, and I think we all have sort of agreed, like, yeah, let's update the CCAP, but let's not lose any progress and all the other important things, so. You know, it's maybe a little more time intensive on us, but that's why we're here, we already have momentum in the working groups. Thank you, Andrew. No, I think that's where I'm at.
I agree as well. Yeah.
I think you laying it out and realizing that it doesn't actually get the total process to be any quicker is interesting and totally makes sense. But I do think that additional time allows for deeper understanding in these changes, and I think to do the change and do it justice of like actually updating for our actually making the update substantive, I think it's helpful to have time to do as much of that, or realize like, oh shoot, we might need to do a little bit more research before we bring this back to the whole committee, so it doesn't push the process out as much in the actual committee meeting if there's more opportunity for discussion. So I'm also supportive of that.
I think the process works well. I mean, you can kind of, each working group sort of has their own specialty knowledge, and then the rest of the committee members are all very well informed, and everyone seems to ask pretty good questions as a means of vetting all those outcomes. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that, yeah, it will be, especially if you all want to keep the regular committee meetings, because I was thinking that potentially during the months of the working groups that we would not do the full committee meetings, because some of you are in multiple working groups as it is. So that would just be a lot of time. I'm fine with that because this is my day job, so I've got the time. But yeah, just you know, just if you guys want to do it in the working groups, just knowing that it will probably be during, you know, those months, just a lot of meeting time.
I had, thanks for sharing this, Cassie, and I think that timeline totally does make sense, and I can understand why it seems ambitious. I'm just trying to think of capacity wise. I'm trying to because this is like the CCAP update process, natural gas policy options process, and then also like supporting us and leading us on our working group actions that we're prioritizing for this year as well. I'm just trying to see if does that seem like it's all possible on your end capacity wise? Because I do worry about whether that seems ambitious from both the committee capacity, but especially also from staff capacity side.
I mean, I think we can, like, if we schedule the meetings, I think I can. It just, I think what, yeah, I think it'll be fine.
Okay, I think especially if there is another committee formed for the natural gas policy options, I think I'm just considering how much. Yeah, I don't understand how much capacity it would take, but if it sounds doable, then my take is I also agree with the working groups. The only piece that I personally feel where the full committee might be helpful is the adding new actions side of it, because I think there might be some ideas that folks may have from outside the working groups that could be valuable to at least consider later in the process for the prioritization. So I think maybe like starting with that full committee for that piece and then going to the working groups, if there's interest in that. But I know even like talking about green building stuff, like that could be something the waste materials group can look at, but we don't, we haven't specifically talked about it until now.
One thing we had talked about was, yeah, having some way to get ideas to the working group. So whether we do it as a full committee or, email the lead, but make sure that there's an opportunity for everyone to kind of like weigh in on actions to be considered ahead of time.
I think too, Covey, to answer your resource question a little bit more, what I was trying to think about is that I think what would happen if we start being staff constrained, where you would see it would be like, oh, I need to schedule 4 working groups in June and July. And it may be that because of scheduling conflicts between the other stuff, I have going on, but also you all have going on. We just end up moving the timeline a little bit slower. So it's hard to say just full stop, like we don't have capacity for this or that. I think it's just with how many things going on, the biggest risk is that it's just hard. Things each move a little bit slower to try to accommodate doing all things, but at least all the things would still be moving forward. Where if we were just doing one of those things, there would just be less scheduling conflicts and, we would just like, as staff, we would just be taking those next steps, maybe a few days or a week sooner, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I agree with other folks on doing the work in the work groups, but in terms of scheduling, if we can get those meetings scheduled as soon as possible, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
To avoid conflicts later on.
Yeah.
Are you guys in favor of trying to start in May? My thought was the May meeting would really be doing the progress report, which we did about a year ago, but it would be revisiting that progress report. And then also I would come with a list of proposed actions that we would just be taking off the list and putting them into a complete list. So there's a few things, some of them are ongoing, which would stay, but there are some things that we just did. And so that May meeting would be going through the progress report and being like, okay, these 6 things are completely done. We're going to move them to the complete list. Are you guys comfortable with that? So would you guys like to start that process as soon as May?
Yes.
Yeah.
Lots of head nods.
What was that?
Yes.
Lots of head nods.
Oh, good. Okay, cool.
I brought this up before, and I think I just want to share the concern. And I think maybe there's it sounds like Cassie, you're saying there is a way to do both. But I just want to share the concern of, especially from the waste materials, from my position being part of the waste materials working group and like having some of those priority actions that we just shared in this meeting. Trying to make sure we don't lose track of like the work we're also doing at the same time as this, because I feel like as someone who has ADHD, I feel like it's often hard when I have like focus on like the update process versus also trying to do the priority actions for the year. And I feel like sometimes one will supersede the other and then the other piece just kind of sits there. So I just want to share that at least if there's processes or ways to make sure we're still moving forward on the actions itself while also doing the capital process. So I think there's more like there's a time and a capacity thing, but also like a focus and energy available to focus on those things.
Yeah, and Covey, I'm glad you brought it up because I do see that as a big risk. And I think going back to your question on staff capacity, I know even for me, I think that's the other thing that I could see happening is if we're going full bore with this and the natural gas group at the same time, especially because some of the existing actions, we tend to get a little stuck on them. Like we don't know what the next step is. And so we tell ourselves we'll keep thinking about that, but then, there's a lot of other things to think about. So I do think that's a risk of starting both of these soon is that it will be easier to lose sight of making progress on some of those other ones, especially the harder ones. I think the outreach and education seems like a really big priority among all groups, that I feel confident about being able to make progress on those actions, but some of the other ones feel like they could be harder. And I think for you all as well, because a lot of times I can't move some things forward until, you're all available to meet and come up with recommendations and provide direction on them. So yeah.
An idea I just had, I'm just wondering if it would make sense to almost see if there's interest in having a lead person for the CCAP update process in each working group that's not the lead for the other work that's being done. And then that way there's just someone designated to serve that role separately from the other work that's being done.
Yeah, I think we could brainstorm. I was thinking in a similar path. I used to work in corporate sustainability, and so you had a million different goals being managed throughout a million different places all at the same time, and just having some level of ownership over the individual projects. I kind of think that the CCAP process is going to be largely shepherded by Cassie, and since we already have established groups, that is mostly about participation rather than like Cassie's doing a lot of the herding and making sure that it's moving forward. Not trying to put you volunteer you, Cassie, but it seems like she's kind of described that process.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Maybe something that each group could do is try to identify, even though everyone's contributing, try to identify an owner of the actions that you're wanting to continue to move forward that can be paying attention to progress made or where things are stalled out. So then it's kind of diffused and everyone's like, I have my one thing I'm going to make sure that can move forward, and then participate in all of these other pieces as they come up. So if other folks have ideas, structure wise, I think it's a good identified challenge.
Okay, well, we only have a couple of minutes. So I'm hearing that we want to rely heavily on the work groups and then just move ahead.
Can we look at the month by month slide? I was just going back to my question about this and the natural gas process. Like, where do they come together, if at all? Right? Is the natural gas process gonna add actions somehow, or?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. I think where the natural gas process fits in is that the recommendations that come out of the natural gas process, in my mind, would be would become new CCAP actions, most likely in the energy and buildings, or maybe some in the energy supply sectors. And because we hope to have that process done by the end of this year. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I guess part of me was thinking that because if we get that analysis mostly done by the end of this summer, that you all would have enough information from that analysis to be able to take the information from that analysis and include those as recommendations in the CCAP. And then if the natural gas recommendations with the broader committee end up different, that also might be okay. If the ECC has has looked at the information and comes up with a slightly different, I guess we'd have to think about that because we don't want completely differing. We don't want opposing policy recommendations and then not being sure how we are gonna remedy those. But the reason I didn't worry too much about it is because it's a little bit hard to tell exactly. So I was thinking we would kind of be able to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the analysis portion of the CCAP and one consultant evaluating actions, and then if there's a parallel analysis, just making sure we have ways for those two to talk to each other.
Yeah, definitely.
things being analyzed in the natural gas process that should be mirrored in the actions to be evaluated in the CCAP.
Yeah.
Timing would generally work to do that. So it's just something to watch for when we get there.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking. I feel like because the analyses are happening at similar times, that we would be able to communicate them to each other, and that is kind of how I was thinking of it, without needing to wait for, because it just seemed like I didn't think there'd be support from you all or the council to say we need to wait until the recommendations are 100% finalized in the natural gas, which might not be until January to even start the discussion. So because they were kind of happening at the same time, we kind of did that with the first CCAP. We had the transportation system plan, which was being developed, and the solid waste management system plan that was being developed at the same time. And so we had kind of a similar uncertainty there. And then we were able to just kind of adapt the plan to wherever the other one was at. So if it was the case that the natural gas was taking much longer and we didn't feel like the information that we had from the natural gas group, it was not complete enough to put good information in the CCAP, we can kind of refer to that process. We can refer to the outcome of that in the CCAP and say, advance the recommendations from the natural gas group. So we've typically been able to, it's never ideal, an ideal situation is that one just happens entirely before the other. But if not, with the CCAP, we've been able to kind of adapt the language to just meet the other process where it's at.
I had two quick thoughts, but I know we're at time, so I can hold them until next meeting if needed.
I don't know, Cassie, do we need, we're gonna bring this back up again next month?
We can, if you guys would like to keep talking about it, we can, because yeah, I still want to do agenda review really quick. So maybe we can move on to agenda review and you all can let me know if we want to continue talking about this.
Yeah.
Does that sound good? So I have for our next meeting that we'll do the communications discussion. Initially, I thought we might break up into working groups for that, but I think there's value in that kind of holistic one that we talked about. So that's our big topic for next month. I left in there that we would maybe do some prep for the work session, but I don't actually think we'll need to do that on a full committee level. We can just kind of give an update on that. So for next month, we'll do communications, and then do we want to talk about the tree code letter again, or do we want to talk more about do we want to just keep talking about the CCAP process, or I think we might be able to do both of those if they're both fairly short.
Yeah, I imagine they'll both be more developed updates, changes.
And I think this discussion is like, we've had some chance to talk about it, so there might still be more, but it's not gonna be the same length as today.
So do we want to have on the agenda space for all three of those next month?
Why not?
Okay. And then I think right now in April, we don't have anything planned. So I was thinking that perhaps there might be a working group, something from the working groups to report back. So you guys can just keep that in mind that we've got some time in April. And then in May, we'll start the CCAP update.
Is April also when the natural gas process would potentially or that's when you're contracting? Never mind.
Yeah, because we have to wait until the March 20th work session to start any sort of so after the work session, we'll finalize the scope of work and then try to get someone on board. And depending if we're also going that committee route, we would also be spending that time trying to get the committee stood up, which in and of itself actually takes a little bit of time if we were going to do it formally, just depending how we do it.
Good,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, perfect.
All right, is there anything left? Any last notes? Not seeing any. Meeting adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
A lot of